They saw it burning. They saw pieces of metal ripping off its wings. They saw the sky itself swallowing the bomber whole. But no matter how many times the German pilots dove, fired, and climbed back for another pass, the American B-17 Flying Fortress simply refused to fall. From the cockpit of their Messerschmitts, German fighter aces watched in disbelief as the battered bomber, its engine smoking, its fuselage shredded, its crew fighting for breath, kept pushing forward through the clouds like a machine blessed with 9 lives. They had shot down dozens of bombers before. They knew exactly how a dying aircraft spiraled, collapsed, and vanished. But this one didn't follow any rule of war or gravity. And in that moment, high above Europe, a chilling thought crept into their minds. If this thing won't go down, how many more are coming? In the brutal skies over Europe, survival was a luxury few could afford. Every mission was a gamble, fighters hunting from above, flak exploding from below, and endless fields of darkness stretching between life and death. Yet in the middle of this chaos, one machine rose to a status almost mythical, the B-17 Flying Fortress. Designed not just to fly, but to endure the impossible, the B-17 became the backbone of America's strategic bombing campaign. Its heavy armor, powerful engines, and unmatched resilience turned it into a symbol of hope for Allied crews, and a nightmare for anyone wearing a Luftwaffe uniform. German pilots had studied its blueprints, memorized its weaknesses, and trained relentlessly to bring it down. But nothing prepared them for the terrifying reality of facing thousands of these fortresses filling the sky, moving like a metal storm toward the German heartland. And then came the stories. Stories of B-17s returning home with wings torn open, tails missing, engines dead, and entire sections blown apart. Stories so unbelievable that even seasoned pilots hesitated to accept them. But one encounter stood above the rest, an event that would send a message across the Luftwaffe. Some fortresses simply refused to die. Long before it terrified German fighter pilots, the B-17 Flying Fortress began as a simple idea. What if a bomber could protect itself? In an era when most military aircraft were fragile, thin-skinned machines relying entirely on fighter escorts, Boeing engineers envisioned something radically different, an aircraft so tough, so heavily armed, and so resilient that it could punch its way to the target and fight its way back home. In 1934, this idea took shape in the form of the Model 299 prototype. Reporters invited to its first demonstration flight stared in awe at its 4 massive engines, its sleek lines, and the astonishing number of machine guns protruding from every angle. One journalist whispered a phrase that would become legend. "It's a flying fortress." The name stuck instantly. When the U.S. Army Air Corps adopted the design, engineers strengthened the airframe, added self-sealing fuel tanks, improved the defensive turrets, and reinforced nearly every part of the structure. The goal wasn't elegance, it was survival. Every inch of the aircraft served a purpose: defend the crew, reach the target, and return home regardless of what the sky threw at it. As Europe plunged into war in 1939, American commanders realized they needed a bomber that could fly higher, farther, and deadlier than anything the Axis powers could stop. Production of the B-17 ramped up, and by the time America entered the war, the Flying Fortress stood ready. The Germans, however, were not impressed. Not yet. Luftwaffe analysts examined early reports of the aircraft and dismissed many of its strengths as exaggerated. They believed their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s would tear apart any bomber formation with ease, just as they had done to British aircraft during the Blitz. The Germans were confident, experienced, and armed with deadly cannons. To them, the B-17 was just another target. But that confidence began to crack the moment the first flying fortresses crossed the European coastline in 1942. The Germans expected easy kills. Instead, they found themselves facing a formation of aircraft bristling with guns, chin turrets, dorsal turrets, ball turrets, waist gunners, tail gunners, all coordinated, disciplined, and ready to create walls of lead in every direction. It wasn't just a bomber. It was a fortress in the sky. And for the Luftwaffe, this was only the beginning of their nightmare. At first, the German Luftwaffe treated the B-17 like any other bomber: approach from the rear, fire short bursts, and watch it fall. But the moment those tactics met reality, German pilots were forced into an ugly awakening. The first wave of Messerschmitts dove toward a formation of flying fortresses with absolute confidence. But instead of breaking apart, the bombers responded with a coordinated storm of .50 caliber fire. Tracer lines crossed the sky, forming deadly geometric patterns that turned the airspace around the bombers into a fortress of lead. One German pilot later recalled, "It felt like flying into a meat grinder." The Luftwaffe quickly realized that approaching from behind, their usual tactic, was suicide. The B-17's tail guns were too precise, too deadly, and too unforgiving. So German pilots shifted to frontal attacks. It made sense on paper. The nose of the bomber looked vulnerable, and at closing speeds over 600 miles per hour, American gunners would have only seconds to react. But even this adjustment came with a price. The Flying Fortress crews adapted fast. The legendary chin turret, a later upgrade, gave the bomber sharp, deadly teeth facing forward. Frontal attacks soon became just as hazardous as rear assaults. German pilots who attempted head-on passes often described seeing nothing but flashing gun barrels and an impenetrable hail of bullets screaming toward their cockpit. Still, the Luftwaffe did not back down. They were veterans of countless battles, from Poland to France, from Britain to Russia. Their pride wouldn't allow retreat. Instead, they escalated the fight. They formed attack groups, sometimes bringing 20 or 30 fighters to strike a single formation. They experimented with new tactics. Vertical dives from above, slicing through the formation. Upward climbs, firing 20mm cannons into the belly of the bomber. High-speed slashing attacks, hoping to overwhelm the defensive gunners. The Germans even began loading their fighters with heavier cannons, firing explosive shells designed to rip through armor and detonate inside the fuselage. And yet, the B-17 still refused to die. German pilots grew increasingly frustrated. Time after time, they poured ammunition into the bombers, tearing large holes in wings, shredding control surfaces, blasting engines into flames, only to watch the fortresses stubbornly remain in formation. Then came the moment none of them expected. Reports emerged of B-17s returning to base with damage so severe that any other aircraft would have disintegrated in mid-air. One bomber landed with its entire tail nearly severed. Another survived after losing 3 engines. A third came home with a hole big enough for a truck to drive through. These stories shook the Luftwaffe. Confidence turned into caution, and caution slowly transformed into fear. But nothing would prepare them for the incident that created the legend, the moment when German pilots emptied everything they had into a single B-17. And still couldn't bring it down. High above enemy territory, at 25,000 feet, the air was thin, freezing, and hostile. The mission was supposed to be routine, another strategic bombing run over German industrial centers. But nothing about this day would be routine. This would become one of the most unbelievable survival stories in aviation history. The formation of B-17s had just released its payload when the first wave of German fighters appeared like dark shadows rising through the clouds. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s sliced upward with terrifying speed, their cannons glowing as they prepared to unleash chaos. At the edge of the formation flew a single B-17 known to its crew as the Iron Maiden. It wasn't special by design, but fate had chosen it for a test beyond anything Boeing engineers could have imagined. The Germans struck with brutal precision. The first cannon shells tore into the nose of the bomber, shattering windows and sending shards of glass raining onto the bombardier. The second volley ripped through the No. 3 engine, which burst into flames instantly. The bomber lurched violently, dropping altitude as the pilot struggled to regain control. Inside the aircraft, chaos erupted. The radio operator was thrown against the wall. The waist gunners screamed for ammunition. The ball turret gunner spun wildly, searching for targets as oxygen lines froze in the bitter cold. But the B-17 did not fall. The pilot leveled the aircraft, keeping it, miraculously, within the formation. That alone shocked the Germans. Most bombers, after losing an engine and suffering nose damage, would spiral downward, becoming easy prey. But this one held on like a wounded animal refusing to die. So the Germans escalated. A second wave of fighters dove, firing bursts of 20mm incendiary shells. Explosions rattled the fuselage. A massive hole appeared near the waist section, big enough for a man to climb through. Wind screamed through the opening, threatening to tear the aircraft apart. Still, the B-17 held on. The tail gunner shouted through the intercom, voice trembling, "They're coming in again. 6 fighters, straight at us." Before he could finish, a cannon blast ripped through the tail section, nearly severing it entirely. The rudder hung by a thread, cables snapping in the wind like metallic whips. The tail gunner's compartment was shredded, yet unbelievably, he survived, clinging to consciousness. German pilots pulled alongside the bomber, expecting to see a crew ready to bail out. Instead, they saw something that sent a chill through them. The gunners were still fighting. Even with oxygen masks damaged, even with blood freezing on their gloves, the American crew kept firing, sending accurate bursts of .50 caliber rounds toward the incoming fighters. One German ace later recalled, "It was like shooting at a ghost. No matter how much we hit it, it kept coming." The B-17 dropped lower, struggling to maintain altitude. Smoke trailed behind it like a long black scar across the sky. But as long as the wings stayed attached, barely, the crew refused to abandon the aircraft. The German fighters regrouped for a final attack. They were low on fuel and ammunition, but pride demanded they finish the kill. 3 aces lined up perfectly, flying wing to wing, preparing to unleash one last, coordinated strike. Then, something happened that none of them expected. The B-17 turned toward them. It didn't dive. It didn't flee. It turned its broken, flaming, bullet-riddled body to face the oncoming fighters head-on, guns blazing. The Germans were stunned. One pilot later wrote, "It was madness. The plane should not have been flying. No machine could survive that. And yet it charged us." They broke formation, pulling away from the bomber, shaken. Not because they feared the guns, but because they feared the will of the machine and the men inside it. Low on fuel and ammunition, the German fighters eventually retreated, leaving the bomber alone, drifting like a wounded steel giant across the sky. And against every known law of physics, engineering, and war. The B-17 kept flying. As the German fighters disappeared into the distance, the crew of the battered B-17 sat in stunned silence. The engines groaned, metal scraped against metal, and the entire aircraft vibrated like it was seconds away from tearing itself apart. But there was no time to rest. Now came the most terrifying challenge of all. Getting home. The pilot, his hands numb and bleeding, gently tested the controls. The yoke fought him with every movement, the damaged rudder barely responded. Only 2 engines were still producing reliable power. The bomber slowly lost altitude, sinking toward thicker air as the crew gathered their strength. Inside, the situation was grim. The ball turret was jammed. The oxygen system was failing. The wounded needed medical attention. And cold wind blasted through the gaping hole in the fuselage, turning the interior into a freezing tomb. Yet the crew worked like a single organism. The navigator plotted a desperate course. The radio operator struggled to send a distress signal through half-broken equipment. The remaining gunners stood ready, watching the horizon, praying the Germans wouldn't return. Every mile felt like an eternity. As the coast of the North Sea came into view, the pilot finally allowed himself a breath. But even then, danger lurked. Fuel levels were critical, one engine sputtered, then died completely. The bomber dipped again, losing more altitude. At this point, many aircraft would ditch into the cold waters below. But the flying fortress still had life in it. With engines coughing and metal groaning, the pilots spotted an Allied airfield ahead. The landing gear was damaged, refusing to deploy fully. Smoke poured from the wings as the crew braced for impact. The landing was violent. The wheels collapsed. The aircraft skidded across the runway, tearing through dirt and gravel before grinding to a halt in a shower of sparks. And then, silence. Ground crews rushed forward, their eyes widening as they saw the state of the bomber. Entire sections were missing. You could see straight through parts of the fuselage. Hundreds of bullet holes peppered the skin. The tail hung by a miracle. The interior looked like it had survived an explosion. One mechanic whispered, "How on earth did this thing stay in the sky?" Word spread quickly through Allied bases. Photographs were taken, reports filed, and engineers examined the aircraft in disbelief. Even hardened veterans admitted they had never seen anything like it. But the real shock came from the other side. German pilots who engaged that bomber submitted combat reports describing a machine that ignored physics and refused death. The Luftwaffe command, upon reading these documents, realized something chilling. The B-17 wasn't just a bomber. It was a psychological weapon. And from that day forward, every German pilot knew, before they even pulled the trigger, that bringing down a flying fortress might cost far more than they were prepared to give. In the end, the story of this nearly unkillable B-17 became more than a tale of metal, engines, and bullets. It turned into a symbol, a living testament to the brutal, unforgiving nature of the air war over Europe, and to the extraordinary resilience that defined both the aircraft and the men who flew it. When historians look back at World War II, they often speak of strategies, generals, and turning points. But sometimes, it's a single moment, a single machine refusing to fall, that captures the spirit of an entire conflict. This B-17, torn open and bleeding smoke across the sky, represented something the Allies desperately needed, a reminder that courage, determination, and engineering excellence could defy even the darkest odds. For the German pilots who witnessed it, the impact was equally powerful. They had thrown everything at the bomber: precise cannon fire, coordinated attacks, explosive shells, and still failed to bring it down. To them, it wasn't just a machine, it was a message. A warning. A fortress in every sense of the word. And for the American airmen who watched it land, broken, burning, but alive, it became a legend. Proof that sometimes, survival itself is victory. That single bomber's impossible return echoed across bases, briefing rooms, and hangars. It strengthened morale. It fueled belief. And it ensured that when the next mission came, crews climbed into their flying fortresses with renewed confidence. Because they had seen the truth. A fortress does not fall easily. And so, the legend of the flying fortress lived on, not just in records or photographs, but in the memories of everyone who saw it survive the impossible. If you want more unbelievable stories from the skies of World War II, make sure to stay with us. Hit subscribe, and the next tale awaits.